Thank you. It's great to be back here in this wonderful hall. I feel like I've spent many times here, and they've all been wonderful because it's an expression of ideas that happens in evenings like this. I'm particularly proud to be part of a week of genius. I was a little bit, my humility's gotten a little off, so when they said a week of genius, I thought, oh, they want me. Then I realized, I'd written about Henry Kissinger and Albert Einstein and Ben Franklin and Steve Jobs, and that's what Susan wanted. And she said, could you speak about your three great geniuses? And I said, who? She said, Einstein, Franklin, and Jobs. I had two thoughts. First of all, Henry Kissinger is going to be really mad at you for not... And the second was, I said, well, do you want me to take all I know about all three of these people and their genius and do it in 45 minutes? She said, yeah. I said, well, I'm not sure I can get it all in 45 minutes. How should I do it? And she said, talk slowly. You'll be able to fill the time. But as I look at the three geniuses I've written about, I realize, and this will be a theme of your week, it's a theme of what the Templeton Foundation talks about a lot. It wasn't just that these people were smart. If you live in Manhattan, you come to the 92nd Street Y, you've met a lot of smart people. And at a certain point in your life, it becomes clear that smart people are a dime a dozen. They don't usually amount to much. What really makes somebody special is if they're imaginative, if they can think different, as Steve Jobs said. And that was the key to all three of the people I had written about. So that's the theme I want to develop tonight to help kick off this 92nd Street Y week. When I had done Benjamin Franklin and I had done Albert Einstein, I got a call from Steve Jobs. I just moved to the Aspen Institute, and I said, why don't you come on out to our Colorado campus and maybe speak there. And he said, well, no, I don't want to give a talk, but I want to take a walk with you. And we talked about having done Franklin and Einstein. He said, do me next. Franklin, Einstein, you, Steve? Yeah, okay. And it made me think back to the very first time I had met him. It was 1984, January. I was a new writer at Time magazine. He was about my age, and he was coming to show off the Apple Macintosh, that great new computer he had built with the beautiful curved case that was molded tight and shut like an appliance, wonderful chamfers, as he called them, which was the curves of the side of the case. He made us use a jeweler's loupe to look at the pixels on the screen and how they were bitmapped and formed beautiful icons. I realized one thing about Steve right then is he believed that beauty mattered, and that is one component of what it means to be a genius, is to connect beauty to everything. And then at a certain point at the meeting, he looked up at us, excuse my language here, but this is Steve. He looked up at us in the room in the Time Life building with Henry Grunwald and all the powers that be and young me, since I knew how to use a computer. And he said, Time magazine sucks. Trust me, Grunwald did a little bit of a double take. And finally said, why is that? He said, well, because you should have made me Man of the Year last year. So when Steve talked to me after I did Franklin and Einstein about doing him, I thought, first of all, your humility hasn't deepened since our very first meeting, but I do like the passion, because I came out of that meeting really liking him and thinking that he had a passion for perfection, that too was part of what made him a genius. Because what he explained even back then was that a lot of companies and a lot of people in business keep their eye on making a profit. But if you really want to make a company that will survive, you keep your eye on making good products, and the profits will follow. Because if you care too much about the profits, you're going to shave a little and cut a little from some of the corners of what you're building. But if you care about making just great products, eventually the profits will follow. I did say to him when he first asked me, why don't you do me? I said, well, let's wait 20 or 30 years until you retire. A little while later, somebody close to him said to me, if you're going to do Steve, you got to do him now. And I said, well, I didn't know he had cancer. I mean, I'm just beginning to hear things about that. And she said, yeah, he didn't tell anybody. He kept it a secret. but he called you right after he got his cancer diagnosis. And that's when I realized I was going to have the chance to get up close to somebody who had really changed history. We very rarely get to do that as biographers, not since Boswell got to hang around Dr. Johnson. You know, have people been able to get really close and spend a lot of time with somebody who was a business leader, creative, innovative, and a genius, and watch how their fingers rippled the face of history. And so I thought, you know, he has actually transformed 6 or 7 industries. The home computing industry. I mean, that Macintosh I told you about was the first computer you could just pick up and take home and plug in. It was beautiful. Likewise with cell phones, how we purchase music with the iTunes Store, how we consume music with the iPod, digital animation with Pixar, publishing, my old industry, with the iPad, and even retail stores. He had transformed them all, but even more broadly, he was somebody who had started a company in his parents' garage with the chubby kid from down the street and turned it into the most valuable company in the history of the world. So I said, okay, Steve, this is it. Let's go for it. It's going to be a great opportunity. And one of the things we started talking about at the very beginning was, you know, what makes somebody imaginative? What makes them innovative or creative? And he said when he was young, he once got the chance to meet Edwin Land, the person who had founded the Polaroid company. And Edwin Land had said to him, if you stand at the intersection of the arts and the sciences, if you stand at the intersection of the humanities and technology, that's where creativity will occur. You know, we went through a century after C.P. Snow talked about the two cultures in which people who really loved engineering and science weren't that keen on the humanities, and people who loved Shakespeare and, you know, found math and science a little bit intimidating. But people like Steve and other leaders of the digital revolution were the ones who knew how to stand at that intersection where the humanities meets the sciences. And that is where I think there's sort of a intersection of creativity. We walked in the childhood neighborhood where he grew up early on in working on the book. And he showed me the fence that he and his father was a high school dropout, auto mechanic, but loved the detailing and design of cars. You know, he used to have pictures of all the cars in their garage as he fixed them up. And Steve said, when we were building this fence, my father said to me, we have to make the back of the fence just as beautiful as the front of the fence. And Steve had said, why? Nobody will ever see it. Nobody will ever know. And Steve's father had said, yes, but you will know. Said, you know, a real artist cares even about the parts unseen. And if you're making a chest of drawers, his father told him, a real artist puts a nice piece of wood even on the back that's going to face the wall, because you will know that you did the best you could, that you were a true artist and you tried to put it together. And so when they were building that original Macintosh, that one in late 1983 that he showed us, that January of '84, he loved everything about it, the curves, the case, the pixels. But then he looked at the circuit board and he said to the engineers, this circuit board stinks. I said, what are you talking about? They said, well, is that beautiful? The chips aren't lined up beautifully. They're not equally spaced. And the engineer said, Steve, you've got this case so sealed, nobody's ever going to get into it. Nobody will open it up. Nobody will see the circuit board. Nobody will ever know. And Steve told him what his father had told him, which is, yes, but you will know. And they hold up shipping the original Macintosh for 6 weeks until they can redesign the circuit board so that it's beautiful, even though nobody's going to see it. And when they did, Steve took out a poster board and gave everybody Sharpies and asked them to sign their names. And it was Stephen P. Case, all in lowercase. Stephen P. Jobs, all in lowercase, in the middle. And they engraved it on the inside of the original Macintosh editions, the first Macintoshes to come off the assembly line, where nobody's ever going to see those names. Nobody will know, but as Steve said, real artists sign their work. So that was part of the genius, was the passion for perfection and making even the parts unseen beautiful. It came with what they used to call, around Steve, a reality distortion field. Those of you who remember Star Trek, remember those early episodes where the aliens could conjure up a galaxy by sheer force of will, bend the laws of physics by what they call the reality distortion field. Steve's reality distortion field was that he could drive people crazy, drive them to distraction, but also drive them to do things that they didn't know they'd be able to do. It starts even before Apple is formed, when the kid from down the street I mentioned before, Steve Wozniak, comes over to Atari, where Steve Jobs is working the night shift. Steve had dropped out of college, gone to India to find his guru, spent 9 months there finding spiritual enlightenment, but also adopting a very strict fruitarian diet where he didn't eat any grains, any meat, of course, any protein, just fruit and vegetables. And he said to Al Alcorn, he's a wonderful guy, spent a lot of time with Al Alcorn, both on my current book and this one on Steve. He said to Al Alcorn, who was the chief engineer of Atari, you know, if you have a diet like that, you don't have to use deodorant or shower much. Al Alcorn said to me, that was a mistaken theory. So I put him on the night shift. And Woz used to come over from Hewlett-Packard because he loved to play Grand Track Auto. And they'd work together on the night shift. And at one point, Steve was assigned the job of creating a single-player version of Pong, that famous video game we all played. And, you know, Steve says to Woz, you got to code it for me. Woz says, okay, you know. And then Steve says, you got to do it in 4 days because we got to get back to the apple orchard on the weekend. They were working in an apple commune, hence the name of the company they eventually found. And Woz says, I can't do it in 4 days. That's crazy. It's going to take me weeks. And Steve had taught himself when he was in India to stare at people without blinking. And he said, he just stared at Woz and he said, don't be afraid. You can do it. Woz is like, what? What are you talking about? Yeah. Don't be afraid. You can do it. So Woz finally got so freaked out, he went back to his workbench. He said, I stayed up 4 nights in a row, and I coded the game Breakout. Anyway, that was the first example I found of Steve's reality distortion field. There are many others. When they were doing that original Macintosh, it took 78 seconds for it to boot up. And Steve said, well, that's ridiculous. It's almost as bad as a Microsoft machine. So Steve says to Larry Kenyon, you got to shave 10 seconds off the boot up time. And Kenyon said, look at the code, Steve. It's elegant. There's no way you can shave 10 seconds off. And Steve just stared at him without blinking and said, don't be afraid. You can do it. Once again, after Steve did that a few times, Kenyon just said, I went to my cubicle, and after 2 weeks, I had shaved 28 seconds off the boot-up time. Over and over again, we see his ability to push people to do things. My last example of this, because I love it, it involves the iPhone. And Steve, when he decided to do the iPhone, didn't want it to have a junky piece of plastic on the face. He wanted it to have a smooth, silky type of glass. And but the glass that they were making in the clays in China didn't meet his standards, and he's complaining about it. And finally, somebody, John Seely Brown, who happened to be on the board of Corning, says to Steve, why don't you call Corning Glass? They know how to make glass. Steve, being Steve, just picks up the phone and calls the switchboard in Corning, New York, and says, let me speak to your CEO. The switchboard, being a typical switchboard, said, well, give us your name and number. We'll have somebody call you back. Steve slams down the phone and says, typical East Coast bull. So he gets back to Wendell Weeks, who is the CEO of Corning. And Wendell Weeks is a really cool guy. So he flips the script. He picks up the phone, calls the switchboard in Cupertino at Apple, and says, let me speak to your CEO. Of course, they say, put your request in writing, and we'll have somebody, call you back maybe. Well, when Steve hears about this, he says, that's my type of person. I like him, because it was somebody pushing back on Steve. So they have a meeting, and Steve shows exactly what he wants, the type of specifications he wants for the glass that's going to be on the iPhone. And Weeks says, we had created an ion transfer tempering process that would have created a really smooth, tough piece of glass. We never manufactured it, but we were going to call it Gorilla Glass. Maybe that's what you want. They go over the formula a few times. Steve says, that's it. That's what I want. And I need this much by September because we're shipping the phone in October. Weeks said, I just told you, we haven't ever made this glass. We can't do it then. I actually went to Corning, New York, because I'm an old-fashioned reporter. I actually wanted to hear this in person from Wendell Weeks. This is 30 years to the day, almost, that he had done it to Woz. Weeks says to me, it was amazing. The guy just sat there right across from me and stared without blinking and said, don't be afraid, you can do it. And Weeks said, I told him, I know how to make glass, you don't. And all he kept saying was, don't be afraid, you can do it. So Wendell Weeks, after the meeting, picks up a phone and calls the plant manager for Corning in Harrodsburg, Kentucky. A small plant, but he knew the manager well. And he tells the plant manager, I want you to switch over and start making Gorilla Glass. And the plant manager says, you know, we're doing flat screen TVs, maybe in a month or so we can get the equipment. He said, no, I want you to switch over and start doing it tomorrow. And of course, the plant manager said, well, we don't, this, or we don't have that. Weeks said, I just kept saying to him over the phone, don't be afraid, you can do it. The upshot is, that September, every piece of glass on every iPhone chip was made in Harrodsburg, Kentucky by Corning Glass. And ever since then, every piece of glass on every iPhone and iPad has been made by Corning because of Steve's reality distortion field. It doesn't always work. Don't try it at home. I love people who say, I've read your book, and I'm just like, I'm just like Steve. I boss people and I drive. No, unless you've invented the iPod, the iPhone, the iPad, the Macintosh, you have to be charismatic. You have to bring people along. You have to have a vision. I mean, Steve, even though he was a real jerk to work with, gathered around him the most loyal people because he drove them to do things they didn't know that they could do. He also, as part of his genius, had a sense of focus and simplicity. Einstein once said that nature loves simplicity. Kepler had said that. Newton had said it. Every great scientist realizes, or thinks at least, that nature and simplicity is a part of beauty. So Steve always tried to keep things in focus and make things simple. When they did the original iPod, he said, other people had made MP3 music players. We all remember having a Rio or a Walkman or whatever it may be. But Steve and so people at Apple said, we make computers. Why are we about to make a music player? And Steve said, because they're all brain dead, these music players. You don't know how to get the songs in. You don't know how to make a playlist. You don't know how to get the song you want. I want it to be simple, he said. I want to have 1,000 songs in your pocket, no manual, no instructions, intuitively simple. I want you to be able to get to any song you want in 3 clicks. Don't show it to me until you can get it in 3 clicks. And they keep saying, okay, we have it this way, but we need a screen for the albums and for the artists and for the song. So he said, why do you need all that? Why do you need the albums? Nobody cares about the album. 3 clicks, any song. And finally, they cracked the code, that beautiful track wheel, and especially on the original iPod. Intuitively, without a manual, you just know to scroll it. Songs go down. As you keep scrolling, it gets faster and faster. You want to play, you click it to the right. You want to stop, hit the button. Totally simple. They show it to Steve, and he loves it. But then he looks at the top of the iPod they have, the mock-up, and there's a big button on top. And Steve said, what's this? They're a little afraid to answer him because they know he knows what it is. But Tony Fadell finally says, Steve, that's the on-off button. Steve nods for a moment and says, what does it do? There's a lot of silence there. I think it's probably John Rubinstein who finally says, well, Steve, it turns it on and off. Steve nods and he says, why do we need it? And it dawns on them. You don't need a big on-off button. If you quit using your iPod for a while, it's smart enough to know to power itself down. Once you start scrolling again, it powers itself back up. Keep it simple. Get rid of all the buttons. And that's the way Steve always was. As I said, Einstein also had that absolute love of simplicity. He really believed, he said, not only nature loves simplicity, but he said, I always look at how God would create the universe, and would he have found this method simple when he's looking at a particular theory. So all through his life, Einstein's view of simplicity is the same sort of passion you have in Steve Jobs, including unify things, make them simple. When Einstein was a young kid, first of all, the good news for those of you who are parents is that when he was young, he was no Einstein. He was slow in learning how to talk, so slow that they consulted a doctor. The maid in their house in Germany called him der Deprete, the dopey one. And when he was sick at one point, his father gave him a compass. And Einstein, they kind of thought it weird, but Einstein, for days, is mesmerized by the compass, how the needle, however you turn it, points north. In other words, he is amazed and wondering about things you and I find rather mundane. But with his 6-year-old brain, he can't figure it out. Nothing's touching that needle. It's a piece of matter. It's a particle. Why does it move when nothing physical is touching it? What is a force field? How does that work? How does a force field interrelate, or electromagnetic field interrelate with gravity? How does it move something physical when it has no physical qualities, a force field? You and I probably remember getting a compass when we were young kids, right? And we go, wow, look, the needle, it points north. And really, 30 seconds later, we're on to, oh, look, a dead squirrel, or whatever it may be. We're on to something else. Throughout his life, even on his deathbed, he is sitting there trying to figure out, why does that needle twitch and point north? How do you unify the field theories of electromagnetism with physical matter, particles, and gravity? And thinking about it, he runs away from the German school system. He doesn't like the rote way of learning. But at age 17, he's totally fixated and obsessed because he's looked at Maxwell's equations that describe an electromagnetic field or an electromagnetic wave. And if you look at Maxwell's 4 equations, or if you're Einstein and you look at Maxwell's 4 equations, they tell you something, which is no matter how you're moving, the light wave, the electromagnetic wave, travels at a constant speed. Whether you're going really, really fast to that source of the light, or I'm going really, really fast away from the light is always going to go by me, and I'm always going to see it relative to me at 186,000 miles per second or so. And Einstein is doing a thought experiment. What if I catch up with the light wave? What if I am traveling almost and then just as fast as a light wave? Won't it slow down and won't it seem stationary to me as I'm riding alongside it? The light beam rider is what I call the first chapter of my book. And he said, Maxwell's equations didn't allow for that, and that caused me such anxiety I would walk in the woods and my palms would sweat. Now, I remember what was causing my palms to sweat at age 17 walking around New Orleans. And it wasn't Maxwell's equations. But this is why he's a genius, and I'm just here talking about geniuses. He doesn't get in when he applies to the second best college at Zurich, the Zurich Polytech. I tried when I was writing my book. I just wanted to track down the name of the admissions director at the Zurich Polytech who had turned down Albert Einstein. But finally he gets his degree, but he can't even get his doctorate accepted. He tries 3 times, and they keep rejecting his doctorate. They have no clue what he's talking about. So he can't get a job as a teaching fellow or a graduate student or assistant professor. He applies maybe 15 different places. He sends out postcards. We still have this receipts for apparently postcards. You tore something off and you kept a receipt back then. Of all the places he applied to high schools and gymnasium teaching math or physics in Germany or Switzerland. Rejected at every one. So finally, an uncle of a friend gets him a job as a third-class examiner in the Swiss Patent Office in Bern, Switzerland. Third-class examiner, because without a doctorate, he couldn't be a second or first-class examiner. So he's just there on a stool in one of the desks in one of the main rooms, and he's still thinking and doing his thought experiments. He's still trying to figure out, what if you catch up with the light wave? Why does that needle twitch and point north? And one of the things he's doing is he's looking at patent applications for synchronizing clocks, because the Swiss had just gone on standard time zones. And if any of you know any Swiss people, think about it, you realize they're rather Swiss. They really care that it strikes 7 in Bern. It'll strike 7 at that exact same instant in Basel or Geneva or wherever else it may be. And in order to synchronize distant clocks, you have to send a signal between the two clocks, and the signal travels at the speed of light. Whether it's a light signal, radio, whatever it is, and then he's looking at all these devices and saying, what if I catch up with, and he starts doing a thought experiment. He's not like Michelson and Morley who are worrying about the speed of light being constant. They've got complicated experiments they're doing, or Poincaré and Max Planck, or all these geniuses, supposed geniuses who you're not going to hear about this week. They aren't thinking out of the box. But you got this patent clerk who nobody has ever heard of. And he says, if I am moving really, really fast to one of the clocks, what looks synchronized to me, what looks simultaneous to me, will be different than it'll look for somebody who's moving really, really fast towards the other clock, because of the nanosecond it takes a signal to get to us. We both start in the middle. The signal comes from both clocks. One goes this way real fast, one goes that way real fast. We'll see the signals at a slightly different timing, and we'll have a different opinion on what time it is, what's synchronized. He does it with a train, too. He says, imagine lightning striking both ends of a moving train. How would we say it's simultaneous? Well, you'd say if the person standing right in the middle, right halfway in between on the platform, if he sees the light from both lightning strikes at the exact same instant, then the strikes were simultaneous. Now, but imagine there's a woman on the train, exactly halfway there. And when the lightning strikes, she's right there with the person, but she moves ahead, because it's a really fast-moving train. It's just a thought experiment, not something you could really do. And in the nanosecond, it takes the lightning strikes, the light from each of the strikes to get there. She's moved ahead a little bit, and she says, no, the one in front happened first. All the theory of relativity says is that neither one of them is right, and neither one of them is wrong. You can't say, oh, the guy is right because he's standing on the platform and he's standing still. Nobody is standing still in this universe. There's no such thing as absolute rest. We're all on a planet. The planet is going around. It's rotating. It's going around the sun's going around the solar system. The solar system's in a galaxy, and God knows what the galaxy is doing. But everything is moving. All motion is relative. And so what Einstein figures out is that, oh, I get it. The speed of light is always constant. But time is relative depending on your state of motion. It was just a leap of the imagination, thinking out of the box. Because Poincaré and Planck and Michelson and Morley, they had all read Newton, as had Einstein, but they had seen the first paragraph of the Principia where Newton says time marches along second by second, irrespective of how we observe it. And they all say, okay, that's right, yeah, received wisdom, that makes sense. It goes tick, 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 no matter how we're observing it. But you got a patent clerk who ran away, and he says, how would you know that? How would you test it? So he's doing these thought experiments. Now, if you don't quite get what I told you about time being relative depending on your state of motion, don't worry, because he publishes that in 1905. In 1906, he is still a third-class patent clerk in the Swiss patent. So in 1907, it's not until 1909 that Max Planck and some others, but particularly Max Planck, kind of read this paper over and over again and say, hey, that patent clerk may be onto something. That ability to think different and think out of the box. That's what made him Einstein. He does that throughout his life, and he also thinks visually. That, to me, too, is sometimes a mark of the way geniuses' mind work. Thinks things of beauty. I mean, another experiment, because special relativity is just about time being relative depending on your state of motion. He wants to tie it into gravity as well, because it only deals with electromagnetic fields, and not to make it too complicated, but he still wants to know why the needle twitches and points north, so you got to get gravity into the equation. So he needs a general theory of relativity, and he does another thought experiment. If you're in an elevator in deep in outer space, and it's accelerating upward real fast, the effects you would feel are the exact same as if you were in that elevator, but it was sitting right here on this floor, still, but in a gravitational field. I take something out of my pocket and drop it. Same thing would happen if I would notice it the same way. All the laws of physics would apply just the same, whether I'm in a gravitational field standing still or accelerating upward. So he says there's an equivalence between gravity and acceleration, and he ties that into just a beautiful thought experiment about why does gravity happen. And he said, well, it's sort of the bending of the fabric of space and time. Get Brian Greene here, he'll explain it to you. But he said it's like a trampoline, or he actually just said a stretched piece of canvas. But think of a trampoline. If you roll a bowling ball on it, and then you throw some billiard balls behind it, the billiard balls will go and they'll curve towards that bowling ball. Why? Not because the bowling ball's got some mysterious attraction at a distance, because the bowling ball has sort of made a dent, has bent, has sort of shaped the fabric of the trampoline, and the balls start rolling down to it. And that was his picture of what gravity was like, and he turned out to be right. Benjamin Franklin also had this passionate type of curiosity. I mean, it was pretty cool. He, too, was a 17-year-old runaway. I often don't get asked to speak at graduation speeches since all of my geniuses drop out, and run away. Franklin kind of runs away because his father wanted him to study for the ministry and sent him to Harvard, or was going to send him to Harvard to do so, but Benjamin Franklin wasn't exactly cut for the cloth. At one point, they were salting away the provisions for the winter at his father's home. His father was a Puritan with 10 children, and Franklin said, why don't, while we're salting it away to store it for the winter, why don't I say grace right now? We could get it done with once and for all for the entire winter. So his father says it's a waste of money to send him to Harvard, and apprentices him to his older brother, who's fortunately, especially for those of us who plied that trade, he's a journalist. Publishes the New England Current. He's a publisher, journalist. And Franklin is his apprentice. He, like Einstein and like Steve Jobs, he doesn't take well to authority. So he runs away to Philadelphia famously, opens up a print shop. But he has to go get the printing equipment in England. And he borrows a little bit of money, and he talks to all the ship captains. They tell him it takes 1 day less to get to Europe than it does coming back, something that's not fully explained by the prevailing winds. And Franklin's trying to figure it out, but they talk about the seed changing color in different places. So on the way over, young Ben Franklin has invented a barrel with the trap doors that he lowers into the ocean at different depths and brings it up and measures the temperature of the water at different depths. And from that, Benjamin Franklin is the first person ever to really give a good chart of what we now call the Gulf Stream. Now, that's a pretty cool, passionate belief in science by a humanist. But what I find is really cool is that when he was 80 or so, which back then was rather old, coming back after 7 or so trips back and forth, he's still on deck, lowering it, still with that passionate curiosity. But Franklin's great genius is something you may not think of as genius, but it was the genius that is at the heart of the founding of America. Unlike most of the other founders, Franklin was both very democratic, believed in the wisdom of the crowds, but he was also very tolerant. He runs away from Boston not just because of his brother, but he doesn't like the theocratic, Congregationalist and Puritan autocracy up in Massachusetts. He runs away to Philadelphia, a city like New York, that is filled with all sorts of different types of people, even back then in the early 1700s. There's blacks and freed slaves and Moravians and Jews and the Quakers and the Anglicans and the people supporting the proprietors and Presbyterians from Scotland and in the backwoods. And Franklin realizes that if you create a society with great diversity and everybody is tolerant of the people around him, that'll be a stronger society and a society in which creativity occurs by the mixing of different thoughts and different backgrounds. He creates a leather apron club for his friends once he starts his print shop. Calls it a leather apron club because it's for what he calls we the middling people, the middle class, the shopkeepers, the artisans, the tradesmen, the people who get up each morning and put on a leather apron and try to serve our community. And they make a list of the virtues and values that everybody, that all the tradesmen, all the people in the club would do well to live by. If you've read the autobiography of Ben Franklin, which is just such a delight. I mean, it's not this piece of, oracular writing of somebody who tries to pretend to be a genius. It is chatty. It is conversational. He even begins it with the words, "Dear son," and pretends, even though it's not really, that it's just a letter to his son because he wants to be conversational and intimate. So he starts that form of writing. We now call it blogging, but it's this very informal type of writing, and he can poke fun at himself. Sort of the Mark Twain, Will Rogers, self-deprecating, poke at the pretenses of the elite and the powerful, but also poke at yourself. So he writes about the 12 virtues that he and his fellow members of the Leather Apron Society have created. And if you've read the autobiography, you know them. Industry, honesty, frugality, goes down the list. And being a geek, he makes a chart of each of them, so that every week he can put a blot against him if he failed to master that virtue, or leave it clean if he mastered the virtue. After a while, he's got so many blots, and he's sort of trying to erase them from the... He puts the chart on a piece of ivory slate so he can wipe it clean each week. I always found that a very American thing, to be able to start fresh each week. And it's why we get the phrase, the clean slate. And finally, he's mastered all 12 of his virtues, and he shows it around to the other people in the Leather Apron Club. He's kind of proud of it. He's boasting a little bit. And finally, a member of the club says to him, as Franklin recalls, in a friendly way, that Franklin had left off a virtue he might want to practice. And Franklin says, "What's that?" And the friend says, "Humility. You might want to try that one." What I love about Franklin is he says, "I was never very good at the virtue of humility. I never mastered it." Then he says, "But I was very good at the pretense of humility. I could fake it very well." Now, here's the genius of Franklin, and it gets back to my genius of tolerance, which is he said, "I learned that the pretense of humility was just as useful as the reality of humility. It made you listen to everybody around you. It made you try to find the common ground from different people with different points of view. And that was the essence of the tolerance form of democracy that we were trying to create back then." This is what he writes in his autobiography. And so in many ways, if you look at genius, people say, the founders, what was their quality of genius? And one of their qualities was it wasn't just one trait, wasn't just one characteristic. Genius is often collaborative. Creativity is often collaborative. It comes with teams who know how to work together and each bring certain traits into the team. You know that in your lives, but we biographers sometimes blow it by always trying to single out one individual and saying, here's the traits, without realizing that most creativity comes from a group of people who play off against each other and who cover each other's weaknesses, help amplify each other's strengths. So in the founding of our nation, you needed somebody who was grand and unassailable, like General Washington. You needed some really smart people, conventional smart people, like Madison, Jefferson. You needed passionate people, like John Adams and his cousin Sam Adams. And you needed somebody who was tolerant and had either the humility or the pretense of humility to bring people together, to be wise. And that was Benjamin Franklin. Over and over again, you see Franklin's wisdom, which is bring people together. That is a part of his genius, but it's also part of America's genius. At one point in June of 1776, he's come back from England where he's trying to hold the colonies together with the mother country. He's failed. So he gets back to Philadelphia and joins the Continental Congress that's meeting there in the State House, what we now call Independence Hall. And the Continental Congress decides they need to have a declaration that will explain why we're having this rebellion and what this point of this rebellion is. It may have been the last time Congress created a good committee. It's got Ben Franklin on it, Thomas Jefferson, John Adams. I mean, there's a good committee. Jefferson gets to write the first draft. If you go to the archives of the United States in the big rotunda, you see the Declaration of Independence. Go down the street to the Library of Congress and ask to see the first draft. And you might ask the Archivist of the United States and the Librarian of Congress why they don't put them in the same place, but one has one has the other. And if you see them, it's really inspiring to see it together, especially if you're like me and you've been an editor, because you get to watch the editing and how that made it better. And in Jefferson's first draft, in that wonderful second sentence, he begins by saying, "We hold these truths to be sacred." And you see Benjamin Franklin take out, with his dark black printer's pen he always used, doing the backslashes that a printer uses when he wants to make an edit. He takes out the word sacred and writes self-evident. We hold these truths to be self-evident. He says that we're trying to create a new type of nation where our rights come from rationality and reason and the consent of the governed, not from the dictates or the dogma of any particular religion. And the sentence goes on, as you know, and it says, and they're endowed with certain inalienable rights. There's John Adams' handwriting. Endowed by their creator with certain inalienable rights. So just in editing one half of one sentence, you see how our founders balanced the role of divine providence with that of rationality and reason, and tried to use reason and religion to bring us together rather than tear us apart. I was actually studying that when I was writing my Ben Franklin book, and I had copies of the various drafts that I'd been able to get, and I was down in Atlanta working for CNN. And, you know, at 9 o'clock at night, I would start working on my book. Probably shouldn't say this, but as soon as Larry King came on, I figured I could turn off the TV and do something, well, whatever. The next morning I came in, and we're at morning meeting, and somebody says, "Oh, for Crossfire, we have a good Crossfire topic." And somebody says, "Yeah, there's a judge in Alabama, I think his name was Judge Morse, put the 10 Commandments on the steps of the courthouse. And federal judges told him he has to remove the 10 Commandments from the courthouse. And he's not going to do it, so they're going to send in the federal." And everybody's, "Oh, great, we've got a crossfire. Who's for the 10 Commandments? Who's against the 10 Commandments? Get a crossfire." I said, "Fine, great, good, crossfire." But I remember that evening as I went back to my work, I was thinking, my goodness, here we are nowadays with politicians and us in the media using religion to divide us instead of doing what they were doing back then, which is using religion and the tolerance of religion to bring us together as one nation. That's when I decided I was not necessarily going to re-up at CNN and go to a place like the Aspen Institute, which helps try to bring people together. So all of that was interesting to me, and it gave me a sense of the true fingertip feel, Fingerspitzengefühl, Einstein would have called it, of Ben Franklin's genius. Over and over again, he does that at the Constitutional Convention. That's when he comes back for that very last time. I told you he's in his 80s. He's twice as old as the other people at the convention. The average age is about 41, except for him. He's pushing 81. And they're tearing themselves apart. That's summer of 1787. And in particular, they're being torn apart on the big state, little state issue. Equal votes per state versus proportional representation. At one point, the Connecticut Compromise sort of goes down in flames. It looks like it's all going to break up. And finally, Benjamin Franklin gets up. And he says, "When we were young tradesmen here in Philadelphia, and we had a joint of wood that didn't quite hold together, you'd take a little from one side, and you'd shave a little from the other side, until you had a joint that would hold together for centuries. And so, too, we here must each part with some of our demands if we want a constitution that will hold together for centuries." He makes the motion to have a compromise. A Senate, that's equal votes per state. House of Representatives, that's proportional representation. And he asks them to line up and sign it. And his point was that compromisers may not make great heroes, but they do make great democracies. That's the whole point of listening to the person next to you and weighing in their judgments. And so finally they do sign up, and they line up and they sign it. And as they do, he points to the back of General Washington's chair, and he said, I often wondered whether that was a rising sun or setting sun on the back of General's chair. But now I know it's a rising sun. And then they open the doors, and one of the great old matrons of Philadelphia comes up and says, Dr. Franklin, what have you wrought? What have you given us in there? And he says, a republic, madam, if you can keep it. Because he knew that it was up to each one of us, each succeeding generation, to make the balances, to make the compromises necessary to hold a republic together. Those strands of genius that I've tried to talk about in each one of the characters that I was asked to speak about, you see it throughout their lives, even when you get them to finally to their deathbeds. It was a little over 2 years ago, 2.5 years ago, in the summer of 2011, when Steve Jobs realized, or it was clear, that he was not going to keep one step ahead of the cancer, or one lily pad ahead. He said, I'm jumping lily pad to lily pad. I'm going to stay ahead of this cancer. It was clear that he wasn't going to do it, and he became more reflective about his life. And we talked about legacies, the meaning of life, whatever. And at one point I said, what do you think of, the meaning of life is? You've studied Buddhism. He said, in my Zen training, I began to think of history as a river, but also life is like a river. And people you get to take really cool things out of that river. Things that people who came before you in their acts of genius have put into the river of history. Whether it's an invention like a transistor, or a process or a way of dealing with things, or a Constitution of the United States, or whatever it may be, you get to build on that. You get to take those things out of the river, and it helps your life better. He said, but what I realize now is that life is not about what you get to take out of the river. Life is about what you get to put into the river. Those things that you're going to put in, even if it's just a shiny little object, one or two things, that maybe just a few people or many people later on will be able to say, hey, that's cool, and they get to use it because you put it into the river of history. I was pretty impressed, and I finally said to him, with all of your Zen training and stuff, do you believe in God still? Do you believe in reincarnation? Do you believe He said, I like to think that your spirit lives on after you die. That all of your experiential wisdom, somehow it doesn't just disappear. He said, but then, of course, sometimes I think, well, maybe it's just like an on-off switch, boom, click, you're gone. I was totally taken, I just sat there and didn't say anything. Then he gave me that little half smile, almost looked like the original Macintosh, with the disk drive slightly off-center, looks like a face, beautiful smile. He said, maybe that's why I didn't like to put on-off switches on Apple devices. As for Einstein, all throughout his life, he's, not only dealing with physics, but with humanity, great humanist as well. And in 1955, he's in Princeton, and he has an aorta, a rupture, it bursts. He decides not to get an operation. That doesn't seem like it's going to work. He knows his time has come, so he's in Princeton Hospital. He does quite a few things. He signs the Bertrand Russell Albert Einstein Manifesto, calling for world peace in a nuclear age. But at the end, after everybody had gone the second night in the hospital, in the evening, he had asked Helen Dukas, his secretary, to bring him the papers he had left on the desk at the Institute of Advanced Studies. And all they were papers, it was just a few pages with equations on them, line after line of equations. And he started working on them again that night. Line after line of equations, some with math mistakes. I went to Hebrew University. I actually wanted to see them in person as opposed to just seeing facsimiles. I just wanted to be in the presence of these final papers that he did. 9 pages of math equations with the math mistakes crossed out and fixes, in which he's trying to figure out, just getting a little closer to a unified field theory. Because he said there's a spirit. He felt religious. There's a spirit manifest in the laws of the universe that brings everything together. And that's what real genius is being able to see the pattern, the beauty of that spirit. So there he is, writing line after line of equation, trying to get that unified field theory that will integrate electromagnetism and gravity and the weak forces and the strong forces and explain why particles exist and how they come up in a field, or, to put it more simply, why the needle twitches and points north. And finally, on the last page, you see it dribble off a last line, where the pain becomes, I guess, too great. It just goes right off the bottom of the page as he writes just one last line of equations that he thought would get him and the rest of us one step closer to the Spirit manifest in the laws of the universe. And as for Benjamin Franklin, during his lifetime, he donated to the building fund of each and every church built in Philadelphia. And at one point, they were building a new hall just to the left of what do we now call Independence Hall. It was called the New Hall. It's still called the New Hall. It's still there. You can go look at it. And he wrote the fundraising document, and it begins by saying, even if the Mufti of Constantinople were to send somebody here to teach us about the Prophet Muhammad and to preach Islam to us, we should offer a pulpit and we should listen, for we might learn something. And on his deathbed, he's the largest individual contributor to the Mikveh Israel Synagogue, the first synagogue built in Philadelphia. So when he dies, instead of his minister accompanying his casket to the grave, all 35 ministers, preachers, and priests of Philadelphia link arms with the rabbi of the Jews and march with him to the grave. It was that type of genius, of understanding, that you bring people together. It was that type of tolerance, that type of belief that we're stronger together than if we pull ourselves apart, that they were fighting for back then, and that we're still fighting for, both around the world and even at home today. Thank you all very much. Turn up the lights, yeah. I told Barbie that I would end at 6 sharp, and I did, so that we can have 15 minutes of questions and you can beat the first flake of snow. I'll sign books right afterwards. So please, now that the lights are up, wave your hand, shout, get a microphone. What's my current project? Usually that's addressed like, why don't you write about a woman this time? So I am, sort of. My current project is about collective creativity, and specifically, it's about how the computer was invented, how the computer and the whole digital age. And you can keep your Al Gore jokes because he's actually in the book. But what's in the book is the fact that this is all collective, that these are not one person, no Edison with a light bulb moment, that creativity in the digital age is done collectively. But it starts with the theme that I've always been interested in, which is people can connect the humanities, the arts, to the sciences, engineering, and technology. So it begins with the most important but least known person who's the greatest inventor of the digital age, a woman named Ada Byron Lovelace, or actually Lord Byron's only legitimate child. Ada Byron, by the time she was growing up, those of you who know romantic poets and all will understand that Lady Byron was not particularly fond of Lord Byron, for many reasons. And so Lady Byron decides that the only way to save Ada Byron, the young girl, from being too much like her father is to have her tutored only in mathematics, on the theory that she won't then become a poet. Ada, of course, worships from afar her father and develops what she calls poetical science, poetical math. She becomes a good mathematician. She says it well, and she becomes friends with a guy named Charles Babbage, who invents the difference engine and then the analytical engine, which were numerical calculators, that would sort of either cranked or by steam, and they were the first digital forms of calculators. And Ada writes the notes about the difference engine and the analytical engine, and she has two amazing insights that we still wrestle with today. One is that any machine that can do numbers like this can do anything that can be notated symbolically, she said. In other words, it can process words, it can make music, it can weave patterns, as she said, as beautiful as Jacquard's loom. She writes with a great poetic sense, even these notes about the analytical engine. And so she comes up with the concept of the universal machine that can do anything, that any symbols, any notations, any logic. It's not just numbers, it's not just a calculator. And she even writes the first algorithm and publishes it, showing how you'd program a machine to do different things. So Alan Turing, exactly 100 years later, this is 1837, Alan Turing in 1937 writes on computable numbers and comes up with the notion of what's called the universal machine, 100 years after Ada Lovelace. She's become the Countess of Lovelace at this point, so we have the different name. And he realizes, somebody points out, Ada Lovelace came up with this concept. So it gets called the Turing machine, but it almost could have been called the Lovelace machine, the concept of a universal machine. But Ada Lovelace's other great insight when she writes about these machines is she says, this machine will be able to do anything a logical machine can do. There's music, what I said, art, pixels, whatever it may be. The only thing it won't be able to do is think. It won't be able to originate thought. It won't be a thinking machine. Famously, as you know, when Turing reads that, he says, as a good Einstein would, how would we know that? How would we test that? So he comes up with what most of you have probably heard of, which is the Turing test, which is a way to test whether a machine can think. And it's a pretty simple test. You just put a machine and a person behind a curtain and let somebody ask questions for a long period of time. And if you cannot distinguish between the machine and the person, at least in the very empirical world of an Alan Turing, then it makes no sense to say the machine isn't thinking. He also said that within 20 years we'd have that. Even if you've watched Jeopardy and Deep Blue and whatever, we're not even close to having machines that pass the Turing test. And so the theme of the book, too, is Ada Lovelace's belief that humans and machines, what she called the symbiosis, would always be better than just pure artificial intelligence. So I've now given away my whole book. I won't be invited back to the 92nd Street Y, even though I haven't finished writing it. But it is basically Ada Lovelace's two visions and how they help frame the digital age.
And I wonder if you could spend a few minutes talking about the process. What do you find the most intellectually exciting and the most challenging in the process of researching and writing the biographies?
Right. There are two different types of biographies I research and write. Those about people who are alive, and so I get to do interviews, or even an Einstein who may not be alive, but there are people who kind of at least dealt with him, versus a Benjamin Franklin or an Ada Lovelace. I actually like the process of combining the historical research that comes from archives with the interviews and journalism that comes from my journalistic training. I'm not sure I was ever the best journalist around, and I'm certainly not sure I'm the best historical, scholarly researcher, but I may be one of the best at, sort of combining the two. They're probably much better scholars than I am, but they're scared to come out of their library and actually talk to anybody. And they're probably people who are, Bob Woodward can out-interview me any day. But, so I like trying to combine the two. And that's what's good about doing the digital age, is I've been spending time talking to everybody from Gordon Moore to Andy Grove and, the people who, even Bill Gates, Larry Page, who invented the computer. My process is, for the people who've been dead for a long time. And after I wrote about Kissinger, which was very much a go to the archives, read the memos, but interview, all the, people who, Winston Lords and Brent Scowcrofts and even Nixon who worked with him. After that book came out, and you probably will run into Dr. Kissinger, he'll tell you this, he was not exactly pleased. I think if he reread his own Nobel Peace Prize citation, he wouldn't be pleased that it didn't do him justice or something. So I got so much, blowback from him. I said to myself, next time I'm going to do somebody who's been dead for 200 years. So I leaped over and did Ben Franklin. For somebody like Franklin or an Einstein who's not alive, you have papers which we don't really have today that much of. But there are 40 volumes of papers. There's an entire floor of the Sterling Library at Yale, all of Ben Franklin's papers. He wrote 6, 7, 8 letters a day, every day. You know exactly where he went. Same with Einstein. Every day you see the whole record of his diary, his letters, his papers he wrote. Even when we were doing The Wise Men, which was about 6 friends, this is Evan Thomas, myself, the first book we did, which is about 6 friends in Cold War foreign policy in the 50s and 60s. They had to worry about things we don't worry about today, like, okay, let's go to Yalta and worry about whether Russia will annex Crimea with the Ukraine. But if you go right across the park, all of Harriman and Lovett's letters were in the Brown Brothers Harriman's archive in the New York Historical Society. They wrote each other twice a day. It's amazing. The mail was delivered. Because Lovett had gone back. No, Harriman had gone to Washington. Lovett was still in New York, so they'd send each other. At a certain point, something happens. Around 1958, and you see it in the archives, suddenly, instead of a letter, you get a phone message slip that says, call me about, you know, Cambodia or something. Because direct long-distance dialing happens around 1958, meaning instead of having to get an operator and say, I want to speak to, you know, you can just dial the number. And so, boom, we lose letter writing. We still have, you know, fortunately Nixon tapes his phone conversations, but that got screwed up. People kept diaries, including Henry Stimson, but in Whitewater, when they start subpoenaing all the diaries of the Clinton people don't keep diaries anymore. We have emails, which are sort of good, but archivists and librarians are doing a really bad job as they sort of try to get, I mean, I was talking to Bill Gates, did it with Steve Jobs as well. People are begging Bill Gates for his papers, but nobody's trying to retrieve all the emails he's written in the past 20 years, which is very hard to do because, you know, CompuServe or God knows what. But so we need those emails to be the archives of the future. But there's a long answer, which is sometimes when I'm going through the archives, you know, you just learn different things. And then eventually, to shorten it up, I just take everything I know and put it on a really, really, really long, you know, hundreds of pages. It becomes Word document, which is searchable, has keywords in it, and I do it chronologically. And unlike most, you know, academic historians, I actually believe in narrative. I believe in chronology. All my biographies start with the person being born, they all end with the person dying, and they have a sort of a theory, which is if you learn something one year, it affects you the next year. That sort of goes out of fashion in the academy, but I believe we actually, as Einstein said when one of his close friends, Michele Besso, who helped him with a co-patent clerk in 1905, Michele Besso, is the only person acknowledged in the 1905 relativity paper. He died many years later, like in the 50s. He's dying, Einstein's dying. He writes Besso's widow after he dies and said, even though we physicists know that the passage of time and chronology is only an illusion, it is such a deep illusion that we believe we learn things every day. And, you know, it's a beautiful letter. But, you know, so that's the way I organize my books. Yes, sir. Sorry, I'll shorten my answers, my fault. With Jobs, Franklin.
And Einstein, just wondering if you found any similarities in their libraries or their reading habits.
No. Benjamin Franklin is the only one who's a great library. Starts a library company in Philadelphia, first free library in America. Steve Jobs just didn't read. I mean, I hate to say that, but it's true. One thing, I have a whole chapter on what he would call his library, which is 1,000 songs that he had on his iPod. I said at one point, because, you know, you go into a person's house and you say, okay, let me look at your bookcase. You know, I'd be sitting in his house, there's no bookcase. I mean, you know, there's a couple of books around, but there's no bookcase. So at one point, we just spent an afternoon going through how he curated his iPod. So that's all I had. Einstein, you know, mainly books about both physics, world peace, and everything else, especially when he gets to Princeton. Obviously, in Germany in the early 1930s, it was kind of hard because he was fleeing. And, you know, I mean, it was, Benjamin Franklin is the only one who collected and did a really great library. And I'll tell you just one story about how he does it. He's, you know, he's the nicest, most clubbable guy around, unlike Steve. But he was so nice that they called him insinuating, because he always, I guess the technical term here in New York is sucking up. So when he's a young tradesman, there is a member of the more aristocratic class, I'm blanking on the guy's name, but one of the grand old, like Penn family friends in Philadelphia, who doesn't really like this upstart shopkeeper who wants to be part of the establishment. And so Franklin tries to figure out, well, how am I going to ingratiate myself with him? He realizes that this person has a great library. And so Franklin meets him, and he says, I've always admired, I've been told about your library. I'd love to see it. And so, of course, the man is thrilled to show off his library. And then Franklin asks, could he lend him whatever book the man thinks would be best for Franklin? And Franklin reads it carefully and returns it right away with a note. And it's flattering to this man. And then this man helps him send for books, and that's how they create the Free Library of Philadelphia. And this man becomes a great ally of Franklin's afterwards. So it's sort of not only what's in the library, but the process of building a library was important to Franklin. And he said if he had to say, he did 17 or 18 things. He started the first hospital. He started an academy for the education of youth that becomes University of Pennsylvania, street sweeping corps, militia. Also, he said, what was he most proud of? He said the library company that he founded, which becomes a free library, because he said it allowed every shopkeeper, every yeoman, every farmer in America to be just as educated, if they wanted, as any person in the aristocracy of England. And so having free libraries was his passion, public libraries.
You mentioned that Benjamin Franklin recognized a sort of fake humility.
Yeah.
And Steve Jobs did not have a fake humility.
Never.
Einstein probably was rather modest, I would imagine. Mm-hmm. But how do you see these three geniuses and genius generally? Is there a huge self-belief among people that achieve these kind of things? Do they have to really have a tremendous self-confidence in themselves, or how do you see it?
One thing about being a biographer is that the people are different, and you have to remember that each time. You can't try to jam it all together. And when you write biography, you're not writing 7 lessons to success or the 12 steps to being a great genius or the secrets of a corporation that lasts forever. You'll have a lot of those people speaking to you, but you're writing about an individual person who has flaws and is different. They're different from one another. And there's no one path. People say, well, should I be like Steve Jobs, Or somebody will say, I'm like Einstein. I think out of the box. And I go, yeah, but he knew what was in the box before he thought out of it. So it's not like, let me be like Einstein or let me be like Steve. So I use that as a caution for here's the lesson of each one. I have to think a little bit about it. Obviously, Steve Jobs was about as arrogant as you come, and I peeled away many, many layers. I kept trying to peel away a layer and see if the arrogance, as it was even with Henry Kissinger, had an undercurrent of insecurity, because arrogance is sometimes the other side of the same coin as insecurity. Steve, it just wasn't that way. And sometimes when he was wrong, I remember times he was just flat out wrong at dinner table conversation. You sort of roll your eyes, he would tell you, something about some country in Africa doing that. And I said, no, it actually was. But, and then the next day, he would have the exact opposite opinion, but no self-doubt, as if he had been wrong. Einstein, had a deep sort of confidence in his own intuitive feel about the universe. And he very rarely modified it when he understood something. And so the one time he should have self-doubt is when quantum theory, which he helps start, he just resists it. Famously says, I cannot believe that God would play dice with the universe, meaning that things would happen randomly or by chance at the subatomic level. And he keeps being proven wrong about it. And, at one point, having said this over and over again, Niels Bohr says to him, Einstein, please quit telling God what to do. But Einstein, even as I said, on his deathbed, is trying to, part of the unified field theory is to get over this uncertainty at the core of quantum mechanics. He changes his mind only once and says, okay, I was wrong, in self-doubt. And that's what's called the cosmological constant, because with the equations of general relativity, they say that the universe, if general relativity is right, can't just be a stable universe sitting there. It's got to be expanding, or conceivably contracting, but say expanding. And of course, the universe is not expanding. You can look out at it. So he revises his theory. He calls it my greatest blunder. And he puts in the cosmological constant into his equation so that the universe would stay constant. Of course, 20 years later, he finally goes to the Mount Hubble telescope. They bring him there because they've discovered the universe is expanding. And so that gave him more arrogance in a way. It was like the only time he had totally revised the theory, he had turned out his intuition was right in the first place. As for Franklin, the best speech ever to read, it's at the end of my book, is his speech at the Constitutional Convention on fallibility and holding true to whatever. He says, you know, the one I said, we're a joint of wood that'll hold together, but the speech goes on to talk about everybody here should at least admit, he said, the older I get, something strange happens to me. I realize I'm fallible. I realize I'm wrong at times. He said, it's going to happen to you. As you get older, you're going to realize you're fallible and that you make mistakes. So maybe you should put aside your convictions and look at the person next to you and see if you can find the common ground. So he was always pushing, even if it was a fake humility, that he could probably be fallible, that he could be wrong. And he was very experimentalist. And I think that was at the core of his openness, of his mind. The only time he did do that and he decided he was wrong is when he compromises on the issue of slavery at the Constitutional Convention. And that eats away so much, because knowing when to admit you're fallible and compromise versus when to hold true to your principles, as you said, it's the hardest thing in the world to do. He was always trying to get it right. He said, this is one time I compromised. I should have stayed true to my principles. You can argue about whether or not we would have had a constitution, but that's different. So he becomes, at age 82, the president of the Society for the Abolition of Slavery, to try to make up for the fact that he had, you know, been too malleable in whatever. Yes, in the middle and the back, you get to shout. Nobody will get you a mic.
If you would have to say of the three, who would be, in your opinion, the greatest genius, or the four? And if they, second question.
Who was the greatest genius was the first.
Given their time, and if the four were to have dinner, how would it go?
I think in a different quantum orbit than anybody I've written about is Einstein. I mean, look, Steve does great things. He figures out, okay, I can make an MP3 music player or an iPhone that's cool and whatever. But I mean, we're not talking about, you know, he's in the pantheon of the category with, you know, Walt Disney, maybe even Henry Ford or an Edison, but not an Einstein. As for who you'd want to have dinner with, obviously Ben Franklin. I mean, he's the person who winks at you from history's stage. He is nice. If he were the one, if they were all having dinner, he'd be the one who would be, you know, sitting at the head of the table and keeping things going. Einstein was very sociable as well. I mean, he was a great dinner companion. Steve was just a nightmare. I mean, even as, I mean, there were times at dinners or at restaurants or, you know, people, he would just get prickly if he didn't like something. So he lives right here on the east side. And actually, look, I think Kissinger is the most delightful, brilliant dinner partner you could possibly find. He is also the most brilliant synthesizer of history. I will, not to name drop it, I happened to be at a place for dinner with him about 3 months ago, just as Syria was breaking, and, you know, he's holding forth at the table, I'm just listening. And he said, well, here's what's going to happen in Syria. It is not in Russia's interest to have chemical weapons sloshing around. They do not want, you know, the Islamic fundamentalists on the border doing this. They've got this interest in Iran. So Ivanov will at some point call for a international conference in Geneva, and he will pull, you know, Kerry and Obama's eggs out of the fire. And I thought, well, maybe. Like a week later, that happens exactly. So, you know, I have a deep admiration for him, and, you know, he's a great dinner partner. Way back, yeah.
Does
Well, does Leonardo da Vinci. Not only does he, I mean, I'll say this, and I guess it's semi-public, but I am working up the nerve at some point for sort of a grand finale 10-year book to do Leonardo da Vinci. Now, that is because, I mean, it's just awesome. That is because we know him as a great artist, and we also know he's an engineer in science, but his science and the connection of the science and the anatomy. I mean, if you study the, because he did, worked on cadavers and did, you know, stuff while he was, and then he starts, you see the sculptures change, and you see better than in any person in the world, in history, the connection between art and science. And why in our day and generation where people are quite happy to say, oh, I love art, and I just thought the, you know, the Picassos that, you know, are the Met are great, and I love Stravinsky, but oh, I can't stand calculus. I don't know how calculus works. You know, that we indulge ourselves in our day and generation to do that, but a Da Vinci wouldn't have. He believed it was important to know science and math as much as, and I mean, if I was in researching this, I just went to Vinci, the town, but also went in Florence and looking at the paintings, and they make people do it from the different angles, you realize how much the math of perspective, he's the first one to get it. So I don't know if I'll ever do it, but I was down at the Morgan Library not too long ago where they have the, and you probably, well, I don't know if it's still there, but the horses and the, you know, mechanical weaponry that he was doing for the Duke of Milan and other things, connected right to the paintings, or drawings there, because there were no paintings in the Morgan Library. And so I just find it breathtaking, that ability to connect art and science.
Talking about genius, there's always a light and a dark.
Always a light and a dark side of genius, yes.
Could you comment a little bit about how these three handle their dark?
Yeah, I mean, clearly Steve had a very dark streak to him, and you know, I'll tell you a story of my daughter, which is, she's a little too smart for her own good. But at one point she said, you know, Dad, when you're writing biography, all you're doing is writing autobiography. I said, what do you mean? He said, well, when you wrote Ben Franklin, you were writing about yourself, a networking, up-and-coming publisher, journalist who wants to get in public policy and loves getting groups together. I said, yeah, smarty pants, great. What was I doing when I wrote about Einstein? He said, oh, you're writing about, meaning my father, her grandfather, who's a really kindly Jewish engineer in New Orleans with a wild halo of hair. And, you know, he's no Einstein, but he's the smartest guy I've ever met. And, you know, I said, okay, that makes some sense. And then I said, okay, so what was I doing when I was writing about Kissinger? And she said, oh, Dad, you were writing about your dark side. So fortunately, when I got to start writing about Steve Jobs, I made her read a couple of chapters. I said, recognize anybody, sort of a bratty, some kid who likes tech? She said, okay, you got me. Yeah.
Walter, we have time for one more question.
Okay.
Today in education, there's a tremendous focus on STEM. Mm-hmm. And one of the comments sometimes made is that when you look at these geniuses, they, as you pointed out many times, they have using both sides of their brain. Right. Can you just comment on how you see this turning out or where it's headed?
It is easy for me, and I could get a big applause here to say, and because what I believe is, yeah, when you focus on STEM education, don't cut out music, don't cut out band, don't cut out art, don't cut out things, because as I've said, and I hope I've proven, the connection of beauty to technology and engineering is where true creativity lies and true value in an economy lies. So I'm there. But I'm going to push back a bit, which is people always ask that question. It's like, yeah, you know, science and math, that's fine, but shouldn't they be learning, you know, art and literature? I say, fine, but those of us who know art and literature, do you take time to learn science and math? Or you, no, I'm not picking on you, but everybody should think about that. It is perfectly legitimate in the Upper East Side and even Upper West Side of New York to go around and say, you know, I love Shakespeare, I love Picasso, whatever, but I don't know the difference between a gene and a chromosome, or I don't know exactly what the difference between integral and differential calculus is. Ben Franklin would have thought you were a Philistine, if you did, so would have Leonardo, whatever, that if you didn't try to learn math and science. And so we say our kids should learn math and science, and by the way, we're going to force feed them that at school, but we're never going to talk to them about math and science, because heaven forbid that we ever have to understand integral calculus and why it's beautiful. Now, if you're a, Einstein, or if you're an Ada Lovelace, a daughter of a poet, you realize that a mathematical equation is just as beautiful as, take one of Lord Byron's lines, somebody help me, she enters something softly as the night, or, the wine dark sea. If you look at the phrase, the wine dark sea, you're supposed to visualize that. Well, if you look at an equation, Ada knew how to visualize it. She knew that an equation was just the good Lord's brushstroke for painting something in reality, just like the wine dark sea or the rosy-fingered dawn or whatever poetic phrases. So I think before all of us who are humanists, and I count myself as one, criticize the push for math and science, we should also say that we humanists, just as we should say people who learn math and science need to learn what Homer meant when he said rosy-fingered dawn, those of us who like literature should make an effort to talk to our kids and to understand math and science and to convey by doing so that we believe they're valuable and beautiful. People say, well, math is too hard. And I say, well, do you like Shakespeare? And they say, oh, I love Shakespeare. I said, like Hamlet? Oh, I just love Hamlet. I said, does Hamlet love Ophelia? And then they go, well, that's hard. I say, yeah, Shakespeare's hard. Calculus is hard. They're both beautiful. Get over it. Yeah. Red suspenders. I know the punchline to the joke, yes. To hold your pants up.
Take any person that you've ever done research on. Out of all of these people, which one do you think has had the most exciting and interesting life?
Oh, Ben Franklin. Here's the cool thing about Dr. Franklin. He's a printer and he's a publisher. Then he decides, as I just gave the lecture, to learn science. He does the electricity experiments, comes up with a single fluid theory of electricity, creates what's called the battery, does botany and categorizes all the leaves and plants in America. But then he becomes a diplomat and goes to England to try to hold the colonies and another country together, but then to France to get them on our side in the Revolution. He becomes a great statesman. He's the only person at all 5 of the founding moments of America, the Albany Conference, the Declaration of Independence, Constitutional Convention, the treaty that gets France in the war, and the treaty that ends the Revolution. He's there. So he does everything, and maybe because I'm a bit of a dilettante and I love caring about foreign policy and loving science and writing and whatever, I think the most exciting life you can have is when everything catches your fancy, when you're passionate about everything from why the Gulf Stream does it this way, why storms move up the East Coast, as Franklin discovered, why you need to have a House and a Senate and checks and balances. Franklin just loved everything. And, I've had one advice in life. It's like, relish everything and dig into it. It's, we're pretty lucky to live on this planet. So.
I have a question up here.
Yay. Right.
Process of editing is lost today. If the Declaration was written today, we would see
track changes mode.
we see the Franklin and Adams corrections, but not the Jefferson original.
Yeah.
If you go to the Morgan Library and look at John Steinbeck's novels, you see the evolution of the novel.
What's the question?
Yeah, and that's true of Franklin's autobiography in the Morgan Library. Yeah, go ahead. Well, I do think that, the harder thing is we're losing letters, we're losing emails, we're losing all the archives because they're not saved. I think there's a much greater upside to the digital realm than there is a downside. I remember trying to write my first book on typewriters, typing many drafts. Nowadays, I can sit on the train coming up here and pull up, every journal ever published anywhere in the world. And, I can take on Dropbox, which, by the way, on Dropbox I have it set so that every version of my book is saved separately, you know, in the cloud. So, I mean, I think that we've entered, and I'll end with this, I mean, we've entered a period where everybody, you can find things to complain about, whatever, but with the digital revolution, the ability of art and technology and science and engineering and beauty all to come together, the ability, and this is the most important of all, you know, when I was at Time Magazine, a very small handful of us got to be creative. Maybe many in your room are in this category, but most people in the world never got to publish an op-ed piece, never got to have an opinion, never got to write a poem or a song that others could hear, whatever. Now, anybody who wants, anywhere in the world, can get any piece of information they want from anywhere in the world. And they can blog, and you can think, well, that's ridiculous. People are blogging all night long, there's blather. Well, it used to be they'd sit around and watch TV all night long. At least people are now able to express themselves, to write, to publish. Those of us who used to be gatekeepers at Time Magazine, we don't get to play gatekeepers anymore. And so we are living at not only an exciting time, but a time that really is going to redefine what creativity is all about. Thank you all very much.